Have you ever noticed how certain incidents just vanish from local memory, like they never happened? The Oregon coast holds 7 documented cases that locals stopped talking about decades ago. I'm your host at Unspoken Fears, diving into Neptune State Park disappearances, lighthouse recordings, and unexplained phenomena backed by witness accounts and records. Names and identifying details have been changed for privacy, but these stories are based on real reported events. What time is it where you're watching? Drop your location in the comments and subscribe for more forgotten mysteries. Let's dive in. There are cases that stay with investigators long after the files are closed. Incidents that create a particular kind of unease that has nothing to do with gore or violence, but everything to do with the sudden and complete absence of answers. The Neptune State Park vanishings are one of those cases for me. Not because I worked them directly, but because I've spent years examining what happens when people simply vanish from familiar places without a trace, without logic, without the courtesy of even a single clue. It's the fear that keeps me coming back to this case, the primal terror of knowing that one moment you exist in a space, surrounded by the ordinary markers of daily life, and the next moment you're gone, erased so completely that it's as if you were never there at all. That's what happened along this stretch of Oregon coastline, and what makes it worse is how quickly everyone stopped talking about it. Neptune State Park sits just south of Yachats, a small scenic area characterized by rocky tide pools, dense shore pine forests, and the kind of rugged coastal beauty that draws photographers and nature lovers throughout the year. In the late 1970s, the park wasn't as developed as it is today. There were fewer designated trails, minimal signage, and the kind of wild accessibility that made it popular with locals who knew the terrain and tourists who wanted an authentic coastal experience away from the more commercial beach towns. The area features steep cliffs, hidden coves accessible only at low tide, and sections of old-growth forest that press right up against the shoreline. During this period, coastal tourism was experiencing a surge in Oregon, with Highway 101 becoming a popular route for families seeking summer vacations and retirees exploring the Pacific Northwest. Neptune State Park, despite its relatively small size, saw steady visitor traffic, particularly during the warmer months when tide pooling and coastal hiking were at their best. The first disappearance occurred in May 1978. Caitlin, a 26-year-old graduate student from Eugene, had driven to the coast for a long weekend of photography and hiking. According to the reports filed with the Lincoln County Sheriff's Office, she checked into a motel in Yachats on Friday evening and told the desk clerk she planned to spend Saturday exploring Neptune State Park and the surrounding tide pools. Her car was found in the small gravel parking area at the park on Saturday evening. By a couple who recognized it from earlier that morning, they remembered seeing the vehicle because it had Eugene plates and a university parking sticker. When the car remained in the same spot Sunday morning with no sign of the driver, the motel manager called authorities. Search and rescue teams combed the park for 3 days. They found her camera bag on a flat rock near the northern tide pools, positioned carefully as if she had set it down intentionally, but nothing else. No signs of struggle. No clothing. No indication she had fallen from the cliffs or been caught by a rogue wave. The camera inside the bag contained film that was later developed, showing images of tide pools, sea anemones, and starfish, all taken that Saturday morning. The final photo on the roll was a self-timer shot of Caitlin sitting on the rocks, smiling, with the ocean behind her. The timestamp suggested it was taken around 11 in the morning. After that, nothing. The second disappearance happened in September of the same year. Noel, a 41-year-old contractor from Portland, had taken a solo camping trip down the coast. His truck and camping gear were found at Neptune State Park, set up in one of the unofficial camping spots that locals knew about but weren't technically permitted. According to witness statements, other campers remembered seeing him the evening before, cooking dinner over a small camp stove and reading by flashlight. When morning came, his tent was still standing. His sleeping bag was laid out. His boots were placed neatly outside the tent entrance, but Noel was gone. Search teams noted that his wallet, keys, and identification were all inside the tent, along with his food supplies and personal belongings. There was no reason for him to have walked away without his boots, and certainly no reason to leave everything behind. The search lasted 5 days and covered not just the park, but the surrounding forest and coastline. They found nothing, not a footprint, not a piece of torn clothing, nothing to suggest where he had gone or what had happened. The third disappearance occurred in July 1979, just over 14 months after Caitlin vanished. Dalton, a 19-year-old community college student from Corvallis, had come to the coast with friends for a beach weekend. On their second day, the group decided to explore Neptune State Park separately, planning to meet back at their rental house in Yachats by evening. Dalton's friends reported that he headed toward the Southern Trail system around 2 in the afternoon, wearing a red windbreaker and carrying a backpack with water and snacks. When he didn't return by dark, they began searching the park themselves before calling authorities. The red windbreaker was found the next morning, folded and placed on top of a trail marker post near one of the overlook points. The backpack was never recovered. Search operations continued for a week, involving Coast Guard helicopters, volunteer search parties, and tracking dogs. The dogs lost his scent at the exact spot where the windbreaker was found, as if he had simply ceased to exist at that location. What makes these cases psychologically disturbing isn't just the disappearances themselves, but the pattern of intentional placement. In each case, something belonging to the missing person was found, positioned carefully, almost deliberately, as if to mark a specific spot. Caitlin's camera bag on the rock, Noel's boots outside his tent, Dalton's windbreaker, folded on the trail marker. These weren't items dropped in panic or lost during a struggle. They were placed. This detail haunted the investigators because it suggested either the missing individuals had arranged these items themselves before vanishing, or someone else had positioned them after the fact. Neither explanation offered comfort. The psychological impact of coastal isolation played a significant role in how these searches unfolded. Neptune State Park, despite being accessible from Highway 101, has areas of dense vegetation and rocky terrain that can disorient even experienced hikers. The sound of the ocean masks other noises, creating an acoustic environment where calls for help might not travel far. The investigators I've spoken with about cases like these consistently mention how coastal geography creates unique challenges. The meeting point of forest, cliff, and ocean produces microclimates and terrain features that can turn a simple day hike into a disorienting experience. But that doesn't explain the carefully placed belongings, and it doesn't explain why 3 separate people would vanish so completely over a 14-month period from the same small park. The pattern recognition failures in early missing persons investigations become evident when you examine how these cases were handled separately, rather than as a connected series. In 1978 and 1979, there was no centralized database for missing persons in Oregon, no system that would automatically flag multiple disappearances from the same location. Each case was investigated by the same sheriff's department, but different deputies took lead on different cases, and the connections weren't formally acknowledged until after Dalton disappeared. By then, 14 months had passed, memories had faded, and the trail, if there ever was one, had gone completely cold. Cognitive biases also affected how witnesses were evaluated. In coastal areas, there's an assumption that disappearances involve ocean accidents, that people get too close to cliff edges or are swept away by sneaker waves. Searchers initially focused heavily on the waterline and cliff bases, operating under the assumption that the missing individuals had fallen or been washed away, despite the fact that their belongings suggested they had been nowhere near dangerous edges when they vanished. I keep coming back to these cases because they represent something deeply unsettling about how we process loss when there are no answers. We want narratives that make sense, causes we can point to, mistakes we can learn from. But sometimes there's just absence, just the empty space where a person used to be, and the objects they left behind that offer no explanation. What troubles me most is the community's response, or rather the lack of ongoing response. These weren't cases that generated sustained public attention or demanded answers. They faded, first from the newspapers, then from conversation, then from memory. The aftermath of these disappearances brought some changes to Neptune State Park. By 1980, the Park Service had installed additional trail markers and warning signs about cliff dangers and tide conditions. Park rangers increased their patrols, particularly during summer months, but these were surface-level responses to a problem no one wanted to examine too closely. The local community in Yachats, a town that depends heavily on tourism, seemed to collectively decide that dwelling on the Vanishings wasn't productive. By the mid-1980s, you could ask longtime residents about Neptune State Park, and they would talk about the tide pools, the scenic views, the excellent bird watching, but they wouldn't mention that 3 people had disappeared there within 14 months. The case files still exist in the Lincoln County Sheriff's archives, but they've never been digitized, never been re-examined with modern investigative techniques, never been given the kind of sustained attention that might, even now, yield new insights. The families of Caitlin, Noel, and Dalton have long since stopped expecting answers. The searches ended. The news coverage stopped. Life moved on, as it always does, leaving behind only questions that no one seems interested in asking anymore. What strikes me most about the Neptune State Park vanishings is the silence that eventually surrounded them. The way a community decided, consciously or unconsciously, that some mysteries are better left unexamined. Whether that decision was driven by economic concerns about tourism, psychological discomfort with unanswerable questions, or simple human tendency to forget what we cannot understand, the result is the same. 3 people vanished, and now almost no one talks about it. Have you ever been to a place that felt wrong in a way you couldn't articulate, where something in your gut told you to leave even though everything looked perfectly normal? That's the question I can't stop asking, because I wonder if Caitlin, Noel, and Dalton felt that too, in their final moments in Neptune State Park, and if they did, whether it would have made any difference at all. Isolation does something to human perception that we don't fully understand, even now with all our psychological research and neurological studies. When you remove a person from regular human contact, place them in an environment where the only constants are stone, water, and the relentless sound of waves, their mind begins to process reality differently. I've always been fascinated by cases where isolated individuals report experiences that get immediately dismissed by those of us living comfortable lives on solid ground, surrounded by the familiar hum of civilization. The Tillamook Rock Lighthouse recordings fall into this category, and what troubles me most isn't what the lighthouse keepers reported hearing. It's how quickly their accounts were written off as the ravings of men who had spent too long away from shore. Have you ever spent days completely alone, cut off from outside contact? If you have, you know that by day 3 or 4, your own thoughts start to sound different. Your perception of time shifts, and sounds you would normally ignore suddenly demand your complete attention. Now imagine months of that, on a rock in the middle of the ocean. Tillamook Rock Lighthouse, known locally as Terrible Tilly, sits approximately 1.2 miles offshore from Tillamook Head on the northern Oregon coast. The lighthouse was constructed in 1881 under brutal conditions that claimed the life of the survey crew's leader before construction even began. The rock itself is barely an acre in size, a basalt formation that rises abruptly from the Pacific Ocean, taking the full force of winter storms that regularly send waves crashing over the top of the lighthouse tower itself. The structure was built to withstand these conditions, with walls several feet thick and minimal windows to prevent storm damage. Living quarters were carved into the interior of the rock, connected to the lighthouse tower by a short passageway. In the 1950s, the lighthouse operated on a rotation system where teams of usually 2 to 3 keepers would spend months on the rock before being relieved by the next crew. Supply ships came irregularly, dependent on weather conditions that often made approach impossible for weeks at a time. Communication with shore was limited to signal flags, and later a radio system that worked only when atmospheric conditions permitted. This was isolation in its purest form, the kind that modern people can barely comprehend. You couldn't call someone when you got bored, couldn't take a walk to clear your head, couldn't even see another human face unless you were looking at your fellow keeper. And after months together, those faces become so familiar, they almost stop registering as separate from your own reflection. The incidents I'm examining occurred between 1952 and 1954, documented in lighthouse logbooks that were standard practice for all Coast Guard lighthouse operations during this era. Keepers were required to maintain detailed logs of weather, conditions, equipment status, and any unusual occurrences. What makes these particular logbooks noteworthy is the consistency of unusual acoustic phenomena reported by multiple keeper teams who had no contact with previous crews and no knowledge of prior reports. The first documented entry came in March 1952, written by a keeper named Kyle, who noted in precise, almost clinical language that he and his partner had heard what he described as sustained low-frequency sounds emanating from beneath the rock structure during a period of calm seas. He specifically noted that the sounds occurred during calm conditions, not during storms, when you would expect unusual acoustic effects from wave action and wind. The entry stated that the sounds lasted approximately 40 minutes, seemed to originate from the rock itself rather than the surrounding ocean, and created vibrations strong enough to be felt through the floor of the living quarters. What's important to understand here is that lighthouse keepers in this era were trained observers, men whose job literally depended on their ability to accurately assess conditions and document events. Kyle's entry was followed 2 weeks later by another notation, this time describing a similar occurrence but with additional detail. He wrote that the sound had a rhythmic quality, not random or chaotic, and that it seemed to respond to or correlate with tidal movements, though not in a predictable pattern. Over the following months, these entries became more frequent and more detailed. By September 1952, Kyle's logs included notes about the specific times these sounds occurred, the duration, and his attempts to correlate them with weather patterns, tide tables, and ocean conditions. What becomes clear from reading these entries is that he was trying desperately to find a rational explanation, testing different theories, ruling out equipment malfunction, wave interference, and even the possibility that he was experiencing auditory hallucinations. He documented everything with the kind of methodical precision that suggests a man who knew his reports would be questioned and wanted to provide as much verifiable data as possible. When Kyle's rotation ended and a new keeper team arrived in early 1953, the phenomena continued. Sean, who took over primary logbook duties, initially made no mention of unusual sounds. His entries for the first 6 weeks were routine weather observations and maintenance notes. Then, in late March 1953, almost exactly 1 year after Kyle's first report, Sean documented hearing the same low-frequency sounds. His description matched Kyle's reports with remarkable accuracy, down to the rhythmic quality and the sensation of vibration through the rock. This is significant because Sean had no access to Kyle's logs. Those were filed with the Coast Guard District Office in Portland and wouldn't have been available for review. The fact that independent observers, separated by months and with no communication between them, reported virtually identical phenomena suggests something was actually occurring, regardless of whether we can explain what that something was. The question we need to ask ourselves is this: what creates sound in the ocean? The answer is more complex than most people realize. Oceanic acoustic phenomena include everything from the songs of whales to the grinding of underwater geological formations, from the complex interference patterns created when waves of different frequencies interact, to the propagation of sound through thermoclines and ocean currents. The Pacific Ocean off the Oregon coast is particularly complex from an acoustic standpoint. You have cold water upwelling mixing with warmer surface currents, underwater geological features, including volcanic formations and fault lines, and weather patterns that create constantly changing atmospheric pressure. All of these factors can create sounds, some of which can be transmitted through water and rock with very little attenuation. Basalt, the type of rock that forms Tillamook rock, is actually an excellent conductor of sound vibration. It's possible, even likely, that the lighthouse structure was acting as a giant amplifier for sounds originating from underwater sources that would be completely inaudible on the mainland. But here's where it gets interesting from a psychological standpoint. Even if we accept that there were real acoustic phenomena occurring, we have to consider how extreme isolation affects the human perception and interpretation of those phenomena. Environmental psychology research has shown that prolonged isolation, particularly in monotonous environments, leads to a heightened state of sensory awareness. Your brain, desperate for stimulation, begins to amplify and focus on any input it receives. Sounds that you would normally filter out as background noise suddenly become significant, demanding your attention and analysis. In a lighthouse environment, where the baseline acoustic landscape is the constant sound of waves and wind, any deviation from that baseline would be immediately noticeable and potentially alarming. The keepers weren't just hearing sounds, they were hearing sounds that broke the monotonous pattern their brains had adapted to. And that violation of expected acoustic environment creates a sense of unease and confusion that's difficult to describe if you haven't experienced it. Add to this the fact that lighthouse keeping in the 1950s was a profession that attracted a certain type of individual, men who were comfortable with solitude, who didn't need constant social interaction, but who also understood they were fundamentally alone if something went wrong. That underlying awareness of vulnerability, of being cut off from help, from civilization, from the ordinary comforts of human society, creates a psychological baseline of low-level stress that affects how you process everything. The logs from 1953 and into early 1954 show an evolution in how the phenomena were described. The clinical, observational tone of the early entries gradually shifted to include more subjective interpretation. Sean's later entries include phrases like, "The sound seems almost purposeful," and "There's a quality to it that I can't adequately describe in words." This linguistic shift is important because it shows the psychological progression that occurs when you're repeatedly exposed to something you can't explain. Your brain starts trying to assign meaning, to find patterns, to create narrative frameworks that make sense of the sensory input. This isn't weakness or mental instability. It's actually how human cognition works. We are pattern-seeking creatures, and when presented with ambiguous stimuli, we will create interpretations even if those interpretations aren't objectively accurate. What bothers me about how these reports were handled is the immediate dismissal based solely on the isolation factor. When Kyle and Sean filed their logs, which they were required to do as part of their official duties, the response from the Coast Guard District Office was essentially to note the reports and file them away with no further investigation. There's a notation in the administrative records from 1954 suggesting that the keeper's accounts were attributed to the well-documented psychological effects of extended lighthouse duty, without any attempt to verify whether the sounds they described were actually occurring. This reflects a broader bias that existed, and frankly still exists, about how we evaluate testimony from individuals in isolated conditions. We assume that isolation makes people unreliable witnesses, that their accounts are automatically suspect because they lack the corroborating presence of larger groups of observers. But this assumption ignores the fact that isolated individuals are often more attentive observers, precisely because they have fewer distractions and a heightened awareness of their environment. The scientific community in the 1950s had limited tools for studying oceanic acoustic phenomena. Underwater recording equipment existed but was primarily used for military applications, specifically submarine detection during the Cold War era. The idea of deploying that kind of equipment to investigate sounds reported by lighthouse keepers wasn't even considered, partly because of resource constraints, but mostly because the reports simply weren't taken seriously. We didn't have the framework then to understand how complex underwater acoustic environments actually are. Most of what we now know about oceanic sound propagation, about how geological features create and transmit acoustic energy, about the interaction between ocean currents and sound waves, all of that research came later, decades after these incidents occurred. The lighthouse was automated in 1957, ending the era of human keepers on Tillamook Rock. With automation came the end of detailed logbooks, the end of human observation, and documentation. According to administrative records, there were audio recordings made during the 1952-1954 period, possibly by one of the keeper teams using personal equipment, though the exact circumstances aren't clear from the available documentation. These recordings were supposedly filed with other lighthouse materials when the station was decommissioned. The problem is that those archives are currently inaccessible. Some materials from decommissioned lighthouses were transferred to the National Archives, others went to state historical societies, and some were simply lost in various administrative transfers over the decades. Multiple researchers have tried to locate the Tillamook Rock audio recordings with no success. They may be sitting in a box somewhere, mislabeled or uncatalogued, or they may have been destroyed decades ago as part of routine archive purging. We simply don't know. What we're left with is testimony, written records from trained observers who documented something they couldn't explain, and a scientific community that never bothered to investigate because the reports came from isolated men whose mental state was automatically questioned. Think about how many other phenomena might have been dismissed for similar reasons, how much potential knowledge we've lost because we assumed that isolation made people unreliable rather than considering that isolation might actually make them more attuned to environmental anomalies. The Tillamook Rock Keepers weren't claiming to hear voices or see visions. They were reporting acoustic phenomena and trying desperately to document it in ways that could be objectively analyzed. The fact that we never did that analysis, that we never even tried, says more about our biases than it does about their credibility. I think about Kyle and Sean sometimes, about what it must have felt like to hear something that confused and possibly frightened you, to document it carefully and thoroughly, and then to have those reports filed away and forgotten. They did their jobs, they followed protocol, and they were dismissed. The lighthouse still stands on Tillamook Rock, though it's no longer operational and is privately owned now. The rock is still there, 1.2 miles offshore, still taking the full force of Pacific storms, still subjected to whatever complex acoustic phenomena the ocean and geology create. But there's no one there to hear it anymore, no one to document it, no one to wonder what it means. Have you ever tried to convince someone of something you experienced but couldn't prove? How did it feel when they didn't believe you? That's what I think about when I consider these lighthouse keepers and their archived recordings that no one can find anymore, their careful observations that no one took seriously, and the sounds beneath the rock that, for all we know, are still happening right now with no one there to hear them at all. There's something uniquely terrifying about watching a crisis unfold in real time and realizing that the timeline doesn't make sense, that the sequence of events as later reported contains gaps and inconsistencies that no one wants to acknowledge. I've studied emergency situations for years, particularly how groups of people respond when something goes wrong in public spaces. And what consistently emerges is a pattern of confusion, miscommunication, and fractured perception that makes reconstructing the truth almost impossible. The Bandon Beach incident from 1983 is a perfect example of this phenomenon, and what keeps me returning to this case isn't the initial event itself, but the way the official timeline contains holes large enough to drive a truck through, contradictions that were never resolved, and a collective decision by multiple witnesses to simply stop talking about what they saw. Have you ever been part of a group where everyone experienced the same event, but somehow came away with completely different memories of what actually happened? That cognitive dissonance, that fracturing of shared reality, is at the heart of what occurred on Memorial Day weekend 1983, and it's why this incident continues to disturb anyone who examines it closely. Bandon is a small coastal town in southern Oregon, known for its dramatic rock formations, expansive beaches, and relatively isolated location compared to the more popular northern coast destinations. The beach geography is distinctive, with large sea stacks rising from the sand, tide pools that extend for hundreds of yards during low tide, and strong currents that make swimming dangerous even during calm weather. In 1983, Bandon was experiencing the economic benefits of increased coastal tourism, with Highway 101 bringing steady traffic of families and outdoor enthusiasts seeking less crowded alternatives to Cannon Beach and Seaside. Memorial Day weekend represented one of the busiest periods of the year, with the town's small motels and campgrounds operating at full capacity. The beach itself on that Saturday was crowded by Bandon standards, with an estimated 200 to 300 people scattered across the main beach area between Face Rock and the parking area near Beach Loop Road. Weather conditions were favorable, partly cloudy skies, temperatures in the mid-60s, and what was described as moderate surf with no storm warnings or unusual tide activity predicted. The incident began, according to the earliest documented reports, at approximately 2:30 in the afternoon. This is where the timeline starts to fragment. Multiple witnesses placed the initial disturbance at different times, ranging from 2:15 to 2:45, a 30-minute window that seems impossible given that we're talking about a discrete event on a beach where hundreds of people were present. Alexa, a 34-year-old nurse from Grants Pass, was one of the few witnesses who documented her observations in writing shortly after the event. In a statement given to local police 2 days later, she described being on the southern end of the beach near the rock formations with her 2 children when she noticed a commotion approximately 200 yards north of her position. She specifically checked her watch because her children were supposed to meet friends at 3:00, and she noted the time as 2:32. According to her account, she saw a group of people near the waterline suddenly move back from the surf in what she described as a coordinated retreat, everyone moving at once as if responding to the same stimulus. She stated that she couldn't see what prompted the movement because her view was partially blocked by one of the large rock formations, but that the behavior struck her as unusual enough that she started walking in that direction to see if someone needed help. Here's where human behavior patterns in emergencies become critically important to understanding what happened next. Research into crowd dynamics shows that people in public spaces operate on a kind of social contract, where they assume others will alert them to danger. This creates what psychologists call the bystander effect, but it's more complex than simple failure to act. What actually happens is a diffusion of responsibility combined with social proof, where individuals look to others for cues about how to interpret ambiguous situations. If no one else seems alarmed, you assume there's no real danger, even if your instincts are telling you something is wrong. On Bandon Beach that afternoon, the initial group movement should have triggered a broader alarm response, but according to multiple witness accounts, it didn't. Most beachgoers continued their activities, flying kites, building sandcastles, walking along the tide pools, because the social cues they were receiving from the majority of people around them suggested normalcy. Alexa stated that as she walked toward the commotion, she passed at least 20 people who seemed completely unaware that anything unusual was happening. And this cognitive disconnect, seeing people relaxed and unconcerned while walking toward what appeared to be an emergency, created a sense of unreality that she struggled to articulate. By 2:45, again based on Alexa's timeline, she had reached the area where the initial movement occurred. She described finding a group of approximately 15 to 20 people standing in a loose cluster, some looking out at the water, others talking in urgent tones, but no clear consensus about what was happening or what should be done. This is classic emergency behavior, the period immediately following an unexpected event where people are trying to process what they witnessed and determine appropriate response. Alexa asked multiple people what had happened and received contradictory answers. Some said they saw someone go into the water. Others said they had seen someone pulled out of the water. At least 2 people told her they hadn't seen anything, but had run over because everyone else was running. This fragmentation of perception is critical because it demonstrates how quickly a shared experience becomes multiple different narratives, each person filtering the event through their own position, attention level, and interpretation. The official emergency response timeline shows that 911 received the first call about a possible drowning at Bandon Beach at 3:07 p.m. This is 37 minutes after Alexa's documented observation of the initial disturbance, and the gap raises immediate questions. In 1983, most people didn't carry mobile phones, so making an emergency call required either returning to a vehicle with a car phone, which was rare, or finding a public phone, which meant leaving the beach entirely. Still, 37 minutes seems excessive for a beach with hundreds of people present, and it suggests that during this crucial window, no one took definitive action to summon help. The 911 call transcript, which is part of the public record, shows significant confusion about what was being reported. The caller, an unidentified male, stated that people on the beach were saying someone had drowned, but that he personally hadn't witnessed anything and wasn't sure if the report was accurate. The dispatcher asked if anyone was currently in distress or if a body was visible, and the caller responded that he didn't know, that people were just standing around looking at the water, and that he was calling because it seemed like someone should know about it. Emergency responders, including Bandon Fire Department and Coos County Sheriff's deputies, arrived at the beach at approximately 3:25 p.m. Their initial assessment, documented in official reports, noted a large crowd gathered near the waterline, but no obvious signs of an emergency in progress. No person in the water calling for help. No individual clearly identified as missing. Deputies began interviewing witnesses, attempting to establish what had actually occurred. This is where the timeline becomes truly problematic. Witness statements taken that afternoon and over the following days provided wildly different accounts of events. Some witnesses described seeing a swimmer in distress being pulled by a rip current. Others stated they saw someone walking into the water deliberately and not returning. Several people reported seeing a group of teenagers playing in the surf when one of them disappeared beneath the waves. At least 3 separate witnesses provided descriptions of the missing individual that were so contradictory they couldn't possibly be describing the same person, different ages, different genders, different clothing. Communication breakdown in pre-cell phone era emergencies is something we don't fully appreciate now because we're so accustomed to instant connectivity. In 1983, if you wanted to coordinate a beach search, you needed people running back and forth carrying messages. You needed to physically locate lifeguards or park rangers. You needed to hope that someone had access to a vehicle with a radio. The Bandon Beach area didn't have dedicated lifeguard coverage in 1983, and the nearest Coast Guard station was in Charleston, approximately 30 miles north. By the time Coast Guard resources were deployed, it was after 4:00 p.m., more than 90 minutes after the initial disturbance, and the tidal conditions had changed significantly, making any water-based search dramatically more complicated. The Coast Guard search and rescue report from that day notes that they conducted aerial and boat searches of the area, but found no evidence of a person in the water, no clothing, no personal effects, nothing to indicate that a drowning had actually occurred. What makes this incident particularly unsettling is what happened over the following days. Despite extensive interviews with witnesses, despite searching the beach and water, despite checking with local hospitals and morgues, no missing person report was ever filed that connected to the Bandon Beach incident. No family came forward looking for someone who had gone to the beach and not returned. No vehicle was found abandoned in the parking area. It's as if the event involved a person who didn't exist, or, alternatively, involved no actual person at all, but rather a collective misperception that cascaded through a crowd until everyone believed something had happened, when nothing actually had. Both possibilities are deeply disturbing in different ways. If someone did go into the water and disappear, the fact that they were apparently never missed, never reported, never connected to this incident by family or friends, raises horrifying questions about isolation and disconnection. If nothing actually happened, if this was mass hysteria or misinterpretation, it reveals something equally troubling about how easily large groups of people can convince themselves of a shared reality that has no basis in fact. I keep coming back to the human behavior patterns on display here, the way the bystander effect operated at multiple levels. Not just the initial failure to respond when the disturbance occurred, but the continued diffusion of responsibility throughout the entire afternoon. Multiple people thinking someone else would call 911, someone else would coordinate the search, someone else would provide clear information to responders. The result was chaos, confusion, and ultimately a complete failure to establish basic facts about what actually happened. Emergency management experts who have studied this case point to it as an example of why designated authority figures are crucial in public spaces. When everyone assumes someone else is in charge, no one takes charge, and critical minutes that could save lives are lost to disorganization and uncertainty. The aftermath brought some changes to beach safety protocols in Bandon. Warning signs about rip currents and dangerous surf conditions were installed at major beach access points. The city allocated funding for seasonal beach patrols during high-traffic weekends, though budget constraints meant coverage remained limited. But these responses addressed symptoms rather than the core problem, which was the community's inability or unwillingness to examine what had actually happened on that Memorial Day weekend. Local media coverage of the incident ceased within 2 weeks, with the final newspaper article simply noting that the investigation had been closed due to lack of evidence that an actual emergency had occurred. No follow-up, no deeper analysis, no attempt to reconcile the contradictory witness statements or explain the timeline inconsistencies. What disturbs me most is the collective amnesia that seemed to settle over Bandon regarding this incident. Within months, you could ask residents about Memorial Day 1983 and receive blank stares or vague recollections that something weird happened at the beach, but no specific details, no sustained concern, no continued questions about what really occurred. This is consistent with how communities handle incidents that threaten their economic well-being. Bandon depends on tourism, on people feeling safe and comfortable visiting their beaches. Dwelling on an unexplained incident that might make visitors nervous wasn't in anyone's interest, so the story simply faded. Not through any organized conspiracy, but through the organic process of collective forgetting that occurs when remembering is uncomfortable and inconvenient. Alexa's written statement remains in the Coos County Sheriff's archives, one of the few detailed contemporary accounts of the incident. When contacted years later by a researcher examining the case, she stated that she still thinks about that afternoon sometimes, about the strange disconnect between what she witnessed and how it was later characterized. She remembers the feeling of walking through crowds of unconcerned beachgoers while heading toward what she believed was an emergency, the surreal quality of that experience, and how afterward she questioned her own perception and judgment, because the official conclusion suggested nothing significant had actually happened. That kind of gaslighting, whether intentional or not, whether the result of genuine uncertainty or convenient dismissal, leaves lasting psychological marks. Think about the last time you were in a crowded public place and something unusual happened. Did you take action, or did you wait to see what others would do? Did you trust your own judgment, or did you look for social confirmation before deciding how to respond? These are critical questions, because the Bandon Beach incident demonstrates what happens when those natural human tendencies, those psychological patterns that usually serve us well, create a cascading failure of response and awareness. We like to think that in an emergency, we would act decisively, that we would be the person who calls for help, who takes charge, who cuts through confusion with clear thinking. But research consistently shows that most people, in most situations, will hesitate, will look to others for cues, will diffuse responsibility rather than claim it. Understanding this about ourselves doesn't make us weak or cowardly. It makes us human. But it also means we have a responsibility to actively resist these tendencies, to train ourselves to act even when uncertain, to claim responsibility even when it would be easier to assume someone else will handle it. The people on Bandon Beach that day weren't bad or negligent. They were just human, operating according to predictable patterns that unfortunately led to an outcome where truth became impossible to determine, and questions remain unanswered 40 years later. What would you have done differently? And more importantly, what will you do differently the next time you find yourself in a situation where everyone is waiting for someone else to act? There are communities where silence isn't just preferred, it's enforced through subtle social mechanisms that operate below the surface of everyday interaction, unspoken rules that everyone understands without them ever being explicitly stated. Fishing communities are particularly skilled at this kind of collective silence, and I've always been fascinated by the question of what it takes to make an entire fleet of independent operators, men who spend most of their lives working alone on the water, all agree to stop talking about something they witnessed together. The Florence fishing fleet accounts from 1969 fall into this category, and what draws me to this case isn't just the incident itself, but the social dynamics that caused it to disappear from public discussion so completely that within a decade, even asking about it marked you as an outsider who didn't understand the rules. Have you ever been part of a group where everyone knew something but nobody would say it out loud, where the silence itself became a kind of shared language? That's what happened in Florence. And understanding why requires looking at how maritime culture handles things that don't fit into the carefully ordered world of tides, weather patterns, and fish migration that fishermen depend on for survival. Florence sits at the mouth of the Siuslaw River on the central Oregon coast, a working port town that in the late 1960s depended almost entirely on commercial fishing for its economic survival. The geography is defined by the river bar, the point where the Siuslaw meets the Pacific Ocean, creating navigation conditions that range from manageable to deadly depending on tide, swell, and wind. The bar has claimed numerous vessels over the years, and every fisherman working out of Florence knows the stories, knows the names of boats that didn't make it back, knows that the bar demands respect and attention every single time you cross it. In 1969, the Florence commercial fleet consisted of approximately 30 vessels, mostly smaller trawlers and salmon boats operated by individual owners or small family partnerships. These weren't corporate operations. They were independent businessmen who competed for fish but cooperated when it came to safety, weather information, and the unwritten rules that govern behavior both on the water and in port. The fishing community operated on trust and reputation. Your word meant everything because contracts were often verbal. Deals were made with handshakes. And if you proved unreliable, or worse, brought unwanted attention to the fleet through reckless behavior or loose talk, you would find yourself economically isolated very quickly. The incident occurred on a June morning in 1969, during the early salmon season, when most of the fleet would head out before dawn to reach fishing grounds at first light. Departure times were staggered based on individual vessel speed and preferred fishing locations, but the general pattern was for boats to cross the bar between 4:30 and 5:30 in the morning. Weather conditions that morning were documented as favorable: light winds, moderate swell, visibility good despite the pre-dawn darkness. According to later accounts, approximately 23 vessels departed Florence that morning, representing the majority of the active fleet during that period. What happened during those departures has been pieced together from fragments of testimony, overheard conversations, and one detailed account provided years later by a fisherman named Tanner, who by that time had left the industry entirely and felt he had nothing left to lose by talking. Tanner was 31 years old in 1969, operating a 32-foot trawler he had purchased 2 years earlier. He had been fishing commercially for nearly a decade, working his way up from deckhand to owner-operator, and he understood the culture he was part of, the expectations, the boundaries, the things you talked about, and the things you kept to yourself. In an interview conducted in the late 1980s by a marine historian researching Pacific Northwest fishing communities, Tanner described the morning of the incident with the kind of specific detail that comes from memories that have been replayed countless times. He stated that he departed the Florence docks at 4:47 a.m., following 3 other vessels out toward the bar. The crossing was routine. He knew the channel markers, even in darkness, knew the feel of the current, and how to position his boat to minimize stress on the hull as he transitioned from river to ocean. He cleared the bar at approximately 5:02 and began heading northwest toward his intended fishing location. According to Tanner's account, what happened next occurred around 5:15 a.m., when there was just enough pre-dawn light to see the outlines of other vessels and distinguish between sky and water, but not enough light for clear visibility of details. He was running parallel to the coast, approximately 2 miles offshore, when he noticed the radio traffic change. The VHF radio that all vessels monitored for safety and coordination had been quiet except for standard position reports and weather commentary, but suddenly multiple boats were transmitting at once, voices talking over each other in a way that suggested something unusual was happening. Tanner stated that he couldn't initially make out specific words because of the overlapping transmissions, but the tone was clear, confusion mixed with something else he described as careful excitement, as if the speakers were trying to stay calm while discussing something that fundamentally didn't make sense. As the radio traffic sorted itself out and vessels took turns transmitting, what emerged was a consistent description from multiple boats of something in the water ahead of the fleet. Tanner emphasized in his interview that this wasn't one person reporting something and others confirming it. It was independent, simultaneous observation by vessels that were spread across several miles of ocean, each operator seeing the same thing from their position and trying to understand what they were looking at. The descriptions, according to Tanner, were remarkably consistent. Something large in the water, moving in a way that didn't match known marine life behavior, visible because it was either partially surfaced or creating enough water disturbance to be seen in the low light conditions. Several vessels reported that whatever they were observing seemed to be moving in a deliberate pattern rather than random motion, and at least 2 operators stated over the radio that they had never seen anything like it in years of fishing these waters. What's critical to understand here is that these were experienced professional mariners, men who had seen whales, sea lions, schools of fish breaking the surface, debris fields, every variety of ocean phenomenon that occurs in Pacific waters. They knew what normal looked like. They knew how to identify and categorize what they encountered on the water. And part of being a successful fisherman is exactly that skill, accurate observation and identification of what's happening in your environment. So when an entire fleet starts reporting something they can't identify, something that doesn't fit their extensive catalog of ocean behavior, it demands attention, not just because it's unusual, but because it represents a gap in knowledge that could potentially affect their work and safety. The radio communications continued for approximately 12 to 15 minutes, according to Tanner's timeline. During this period, vessels adjusted their courses to get better views, some moving closer to the phenomenon while others maintained distance out of caution. The Coast Guard station in Florence was monitoring the standard VHF channel and heard these transmissions, and at 5:28 a.m., according to official Coast Guard logs, they made radio contact with the fleet to inquire about the situation and offer assistance if needed. The response they received was professionally vague, vessels reporting an unidentified object or marine life in the water, no immediate safety concerns, no request for Coast Guard intervention. By 5:35 a.m., radio traffic about the incident had ceased entirely. Vessels had resumed normal operations and dispersed to their fishing locations, and the only evidence that anything unusual had occurred was the Coast Guard log notation and the memory of everyone who had been on the water that morning. Here's where the social mechanisms of silence begin to operate. By the time vessels returned to port that evening, word had already spread through the Florence fishing community about the morning's events. Tanner stated that when he tied up at the docks, he was approached by 2 senior fleet members, men who had been fishing out of Florence for decades and whose opinions carried significant weight in the community. Their message was simple and direct. Whatever had been seen that morning was nobody's business. Discussing it with outsiders would only bring unwanted attention to the fleet, and the smart thing to do was forget it happened and get back to work. This wasn't presented as a threat, Tanner emphasized, but as practical advice from experienced men who understood how the world worked. Bringing attention to the fleet meant potential regulatory scrutiny, meant Coast Guard inspections, meant reporters asking questions, and creating stories that could affect tourism and public perception of the fishing industry. The economic factors here are crucial to understanding why silence was the chosen response. Commercial fishing in 1969 was already facing increasing regulatory pressure, environmental concerns about overfishing, and competition from foreign fleets. The Florence fishing community understood that their livelihood depended on being left alone to do their work without additional oversight or interference. Anything that made them seem unreliable, that suggested they were prone to exaggeration or sensationalism, that drew media attention for reasons other than successful catches and safe operations, was a threat to their economic survival. The calculation was simple. Talking about what they had seen offered no benefit and carried significant potential costs, so the rational choice was silence. This wasn't about covering up something dangerous or protecting a secret. It was about protecting their professional reputation and their ability to continue making a living. What makes maritime culture unique in how it handles unexplained phenomena is the fundamental relationship between fishermen and the ocean. The ocean is already inherently unpredictable, already full of forces and variables that can't be completely controlled or understood. Fishermen accept this uncertainty as part of their profession. They develop skills and knowledge that allow them to work within that uncertainty safely and successfully, adding additional layers of mystery, acknowledging that there are things in the ocean they can't explain or categorize doesn't serve any purpose. It doesn't change how they do their work, doesn't affect their navigation or fishing strategies, and talking about it publicly only invites questions and scrutiny that distract from the practical business of commercial fishing. So the cultural response is to acknowledge such incidents privately, among themselves, but maintain public silence because that silence protects the community's reputation and economic interests. Tanner's account suggests that in the days and weeks following the incident, there were private conversations among fleet members, informal discussions at the docks or in bars, where fishermen would compare what they had seen and try to develop explanations. Some thought it might have been an unusual whale species. Others suggested military submarine activity or experimental Navy equipment. A few ventured ideas about previously unknown marine life forms. But these conversations remained strictly within the fishing community. And even there, they gradually became less frequent as the practical demands of the fishing season took priority, and the incident receded into the category of interesting but ultimately irrelevant ocean mysteries. By the end of the 1969 season, according to Tanner, the incident was rarely mentioned, even among fleet members, and bringing it up was seen as dwelling on something that didn't matter, rather than focusing on the work at hand. The Coast Guard response, or lack thereof, is also telling. The log notation from that morning exists in official records, documenting that radio communications occurred and that vessels reported an unidentified object in the water. But there was no follow-up investigation, no formal report compiled, no attempt to gather detailed statements from the vessels involved. This wasn't negligence or conspiracy, it was simply the Coast Guard operating according to their protocols and priorities. No distress had been reported. No safety issues had arisen. No laws had been violated. So there was no basis for expending resources on an investigation. The Coast Guard's primary concern was maritime safety, and since the incident posed no apparent safety threat, it didn't warrant further attention. The log entry was filed, and like so many other routine notations in Coast Guard records, it sat in archives gathering dust, noticed only decades later when researchers specifically looking for such accounts went searching through boxes of old logbooks. The aftermath demonstrates how effectively social silence can erase events from collective memory. As the Florence fishing fleet declined through the 1970s and 1980s, victims of changing regulations, depleted fish stocks, and economic pressures that made small-scale commercial fishing increasingly unviable, the community that had shared the 1969 experience dispersed. Fishermen retired, sold their boats, moved to other ports, or left the industry entirely. The younger generation that might have heard the stories, secondhand, had no direct connection to the incident, and no reason to preserve or repeat accounts that their elders clearly didn't want publicized. Tanner himself left Florence in the mid-1970s, relocating to Washington State and eventually leaving commercial fishing altogether. When he finally agreed to discuss the incident in the 1988 interview, he was careful to note that he was only sharing his personal recollection, that he couldn't speak for the other operators who had been on the water that morning, and that he had no evidence beyond his own memory and the fragments of radio communication he had heard. The oral history loss that occurs when tight-knit communities break apart is something we consistently underestimate. So much knowledge, so many experiences, So many shared memories exist only in the collective consciousness of the people who lived through them. When those people disperse or die without passing the information forward, it simply disappears. There's no archive, no written record, no institutional memory to preserve it. The Florence incident survived only because Tanner happened to be interviewed by a researcher who happened to be interested in fishing community culture and happened to ask questions that prompted him to share the story. How many other incidents from Florence and from hundreds of other small ports along the coast have been lost entirely because no one asked the right questions at the right time? There is one additional piece of evidence that suggests the incident actually occurred as described. A brief mention in the Cioslaw News, the local Florence newspaper, from June 1969. The article, which ran as a small item on an inside page, noted that local fishermen had reported unusual marine activity during a recent morning departure, but provided no details and quoted no sources by name. The article's tone was dismissive, treating the report as mildly interesting local color rather than serious news, and there was no follow-up coverage. This suggests that word of the incident did leak beyond the fishing community despite the attempts at silence, but that it failed to gain traction, either because the information was too vague, or because the fishermen who might have provided details declined to speak on the record. The newspaper clipping is now archived in the Cioslaw Pioneer Museum, one of thousands of similar items documenting everyday life in Florence over the decades, noticed only if you're specifically looking for it. I keep thinking about the choice that the Florence fishing community made, the collective decision to prioritize economic security and professional reputation over public disclosure of an unexplained experience. From their perspective, it was the obvious choice, the practical choice, the choice that protected their livelihoods and their way of life. But it also meant surrendering any possibility of understanding what they had actually witnessed that morning. If the fleet had spoken openly, if they had provided detailed accounts to scientists or researchers, if they had allowed public examination of the incident, would we have learned something valuable about ocean phenomena or marine life? Or would it have simply resulted in sensationalized media coverage that ultimately revealed nothing while damaging the fleet's reputation? There's no way to know now, decades later, with most of the witnesses dead and the memories faded beyond reliable recall. What would it take to make you break a code of silence, especially one that exists to protect your economic interests and social standing? This isn't an abstract question. It's something we all face in various contexts throughout our lives. We work in industries that have unwritten rules about what you discuss publicly and what you keep internal. We belong to communities that have collective agreements about what stories get told and what stories remain private. The calculus is always the same. What do you gain by speaking versus what do you risk by breaking the silence? The Florence fishermen made their choice based on their circumstances and their values, and who's to say it was wrong? But every choice has consequences, and the consequence of their silence was that whatever happened on the water that June morning in 1969 remains a mystery, known only through fragments and secondhand accounts. One more unexplained incident filed away in the vast catalog of things the ocean shows us but doesn't explain. When you're part of a community that values silence, when speaking out means isolation and economic consequences, when the people around you have collectively decided that some things are better left unexamined, do you have the courage to break ranks? And if you do break that silence, are you prepared for what it might cost you? There's a particular kind of regret that comes from realizing how much we've lost simply through neglect, not through malice or deliberate destruction, but through the quiet accumulation of years where nobody thought to check the basement, to organize the boxes, to preserve what previous generations carefully documented. Historical records are fragile things, more fragile than we realize when we're living through the present and assuming that important events will somehow automatically be remembered. The Cannon Beach archive discovery in 2001 represents everything that troubles me about how easily truth becomes obscured, how quickly the past slips away when we're not paying attention, and how communities can lose entire pieces of their own history simply because the people who remembered are gone and the documents that could tell us what happened were left to rot in damp storage. Have you ever found something that completely changed your understanding of a place or event? Something that should have been common knowledge but was instead buried and forgotten? That moment of discovery carries with it not just revelation, but a kind of mourning for all the years the information was lost, all the questions that could have been answered if only someone had looked sooner. Cannon Beach is one of Oregon's most recognizable coastal destinations, famous for Haystack Rock and the scenic beauty that draws hundreds of thousands of tourists annually. The town's modern identity is built almost entirely on tourism, with art galleries, upscale restaurants, and vacation rentals dominating the economy. But like most coastal communities, Cannon Beach has a deeper history that extends back through decades of different economic models, different populations, different relationships with the ocean and the land. In the years leading up to 2001, the Cannon Beach Historical Society operated out of a small building that had been donated to them in the 1970s, a converted residence that housed their collection of photographs, documents, and artifacts related to local history. The collection had grown organically over the years through donations from longtime residents, acquisitions from estate sales, and the occasional discovery of materials in attics and storage units. Organization was haphazard at best, with limited funding, no professional archivist on staff, and a rotating group of volunteers who did their best to catalog and preserve materials, but were overwhelmed by the sheer volume and the deteriorating condition of many items. The building itself had problems that everyone acknowledged, but nobody had the resources to address properly. The basement, where a significant portion of the document collection was stored, had recurring moisture issues related to the building's proximity to groundwater and inadequate drainage systems. Volunteers would periodically go down to check on things, move boxes away from wet spots, set up dehumidifiers that ran constantly but never quite solved the problem. It was one of those situations where everyone knew it wasn't ideal. Everyone agreed something should be done, but the cost of proper climate-controlled storage was simply beyond what the Historical Society could afford. So the documents stayed in the basement, in boxes that were supposed to be archival quality but often weren't, subject to temperature fluctuations and humidity levels that conservation professionals would consider disastrous. Preservation of 1940s-era newspapers presented particular challenges even under ideal conditions. Newsprint from that period was made with high acid content that causes the paper to become brittle and yellow over time, and exposure to moisture accelerates this deterioration dramatically. The Cannon Beach collection included bound volumes of the local newspaper from various years, donations from people who had saved copies or whose families had maintained collections, but these volumes had been stored in the basement for decades with minimal protection. The discovery occurred in March 2001, when Lori, a recently retired librarian who had moved to Cannon Beach and volunteered with the Historical Society, decided to undertake a systematic inventory of the basement collection. This wasn't an official project or funded initiative. It was simply Lori's professional instincts kicking in when she saw the state of the archives and realized that nobody actually knew what was down there or what condition it was in. She had spent 30 years working in public libraries. She understood archival principles and preservation techniques, and she had the time and inclination to tackle a project that others had avoided because it was overwhelming and depressing. She started in one corner of the basement and began opening boxes, creating inventory lists, assessing condition, and making notes about what needed immediate attention versus what could wait for better resources. According to her later accounts, she found the water-damaged newspaper collection in late March, a stack of bound volumes that had been placed directly on the concrete floor in a corner of the basement, where a slow leak from a foundation crack had created persistent moisture problems. The volumes were in terrible condition, pages stuck together, sections completely illegible, the binding disintegrated in places. Most volunteers would have looked at this material and made a note to dispose of it as unsalvageable. But Lori had enough archival training to know that even damaged documents can sometimes yield information if handled carefully. She carefully separated the volumes, which covered various years from the 1940s, and began the painstaking process of examining what could be recovered. Many pages were total losses, but sections that had been in the interior of the bound volumes, protected from the worst of the moisture damage, were still partially readable. It was during this examination that she found the articles from 1947, a huge series of newspaper reports from July of that year, describing an incident that she had never heard mentioned in any conversation about Cannon Beach history. The articles were fragmentary, some sections water-damaged beyond recovery, but enough remained to establish basic facts. In July 1947, according to these reports, something had occurred in the ocean off Cannon Beach that prompted multiple witness reports, Coast Guard response, and sustained local attention for at least several weeks based on the number of follow-up articles. The exact nature of the incident was frustratingly unclear from the damaged articles, with crucial details lost to water damage and deterioration. But what came through was the community response. Meetings held to discuss what had been seen, debates about whether to report the incident to federal authorities, concerns about how publicity might affect the summer tourism season. What made this discovery particularly unsettling was the complete absence of this incident from current community memory. Lori had lived in Cannon Beach for 2 years by this point. She had attended historical society meetings, talked with longtime residents, read published histories of the area, and never once had anyone mentioned anything unusual happening in 1947. She asked other volunteers if they knew about these articles, if they had heard stories about this incident, and received blank stares and honest confusion. Nobody knew what she was talking about. She contacted some of the oldest residents in town, people who would have been alive in 1947, and found either no recollection or vague, uncertain memories that they couldn't articulate clearly. It was as if an entire event, something significant enough to generate weeks of newspaper coverage and community discussion, had been completely erased from collective memory. This is how information gets lost between generations in coastal towns, and understanding the mechanism is crucial to grasping how fragile historical knowledge actually is. Communities like Cannon Beach experienced massive demographic shifts in the decades following World War II. The Cannon Beach of 1947 was a small year-round community with a seasonal tourist influx, populated largely by families who had been there for generations and whose livelihoods were connected to logging, fishing, and small-scale agriculture alongside tourism. By 2001, Cannon Beach had transformed into a destination resort community where most property was vacation rentals or second homes, where the year-round population was largely people who had moved there from elsewhere, and where the economic model was almost exclusively tourism-based. The people who would have remembered 1947 firsthand were either dead or had moved away decades earlier. Their children, who might have heard stories, had often left for economic opportunities elsewhere. The oral history chain that normally preserves community memory across generations had been broken by this demographic transformation. Misinformation cycles develop in these gaps. When there's no reliable oral tradition and written records are incomplete or inaccessible, communities fill the void with approximations, with stories that sound right even if they're not accurate, with narratives that serve current needs rather than historical truth. Cannon Beach's public history, the version told in tourist brochures, and historical markers and published accounts emphasize the town's artistic heritage, its natural beauty, and its development as a resort destination. This narrative served tourism interests. It presented Cannon Beach as a place of peaceful natural wonder and cultural sophistication. Incidents that didn't fit this narrative, things that were confusing or potentially disturbing or simply didn't contribute to the desired image, weren't necessarily suppressed deliberately. They were just allowed to fade because nobody had a reason to keep bringing them up. The role of tourism in shaping historical narrative cannot be overstated. Communities that depend economically on visitors have powerful incentives to curate their public histories, to emphasize elements that attract people and downplay or omit elements that might make visitors uncomfortable. This isn't conspiracy or coordinated deception. It's simply the organic result of hundreds of small decisions over decades about what stories to tell, what to include in historical society exhibits, what to mention in promotional materials, what to research and publish. Nobody at any point probably said, "We need to hide what happened in 1947, but equally nobody said, "We need to preserve and publicize what happened in 1947. And in the absence of active preservation, the incident simply slipped away. Lori spent the following months trying to recover as much information as possible from the damaged newspapers. She used archival techniques to carefully separate stuck pages, photographed legible sections, and attempted to piece together a coherent account of the 1947 incident from the fragmentary evidence. The process was frustrating because crucial details were consistently in the sections most damaged by water, as if the building leak had specifically targeted the most important information. What emerged was a partial picture. Something had been seen in the ocean. Multiple witnesses had reported it. There had been official response and investigation, and the community had been divided about how to handle the situation publicly. But the specifics, what exactly was seen, who the witnesses were, what conclusions, if any, were reached, remained frustratingly out of reach. She also attempted forensic document examination to authenticate what she had found, making sure these weren't somehow fabricated or misidentified materials. The paper stock was consistent with 1940s newsprint. The typesetting matched the technology and style of that era, and the advertisements and other content on the pages corresponded to known facts about Cannon Beach businesses and events from 1947. There was no reason to doubt that these were genuine contemporary newspaper accounts, which made their complete absence from community memory even more troubling. How does something documented in a local newspaper, discussed publicly, investigated officially, simply vanish from collective awareness within a generation or two? My assessment, based on examining cases like this from communities across the coast, is that we're looking at accidental historical erasure rather than deliberate cover-up. But the effect is the same, and in some ways, the accidental nature makes it more disturbing. If someone had actively suppressed this information, at least that would imply the information was important enough to warrant suppression. The reality is probably that nobody thought it mattered enough to preserve. The people who lived through it moved on with their lives. The newspapers were saved by someone who thought they might be historically valuable someday, but then stored improperly, and successive generations simply never asked the questions that would have revealed the gap in their knowledge. This is historical erasure through neglect, through assumption that important things will somehow take care of themselves, through failure to recognize that memory is fragile and requires active maintenance to survive. The aftermath of Lori's discovery demonstrates the continuing challenges of preservation and public history in under-resourced communities. She compiled a report documenting what she had found, photographed the recovered newspaper sections, and presented her findings to the Cannon Beach Historical Society Board. The response was interest mixed with frustration. Everyone agreed this was a significant discovery. Everyone acknowledged it raised important questions, but nobody had solutions for the practical problems it created. The damaged newspapers needed professional conservation treatment that would cost thousands of dollars the Historical Society didn't have. Digitization of the recovered sections was possible but required equipment and expertise beyond what volunteers could provide. Research to fill in the gaps and understand the context of the 1947 incident would require access to other archives, possible travel to state repositories or federal facilities, time and money that simply weren't available. Some limited digitization was eventually accomplished. Autumn, another volunteer with photography skills, created high-resolution scans of the most legible sections, and these digital files were stored on the Historical Society's computer system. But without proper metadata, without contextual research, without integration into a larger understanding of Cannon Beach history, these digital files were just isolated fragments, slightly more durable than the deteriorating newspapers, but not significantly more useful. The question of what happened in 1947 remained unanswered, and gradually, the urgency of answering it faded as other priorities demanded attention and resources. The lack of oral history to contextualize archival discoveries is a recurring problem in communities that have experienced demographic transformation. Ideally, Lori would have been able to interview people who remembered 1947, who could have filled in the details that water damage had erased from the newspaper accounts. But those people were gone, and their knowledge had died with them. The younger generation of longtime residents, people whose parents or grandparents might have lived through the incident, had often heard nothing about it because it apparently wasn't considered important enough to pass down in family stories. This is the tragedy of oral history loss. So much contextual knowledge, so much nuanced understanding of how events were perceived and what they meant to the people who experienced them, exists only in human memory and disappears forever when those memories are not deliberately preserved and transmitted. Current residents of Cannon Beach, the generation that has grown up or moved to the area since the 1980s and 1990s, have essentially no connection to mid-century coastal history unless they specifically seek it out. The Cannon Beach they know is a resort town, a place of art galleries and fine dining and spectacular ocean views, and that contemporary identity has almost completely displaced earlier versions of what the community was. This isn't unique to Cannon Beach. It's a pattern repeated in coastal towns throughout Oregon and beyond, but recognizing the pattern doesn't make it less troubling. We're losing our own history in real time, watching it disappear into damaged archives and failed oral traditions. And mostly, we don't notice until someone like Lori stumbles across evidence of what's been lost and forces us to confront how little we actually know about our own communities. What local history from your area has been forgotten or erased, not through deliberate action, but through simple neglect and the passage of time? This isn't an abstract question, it's something you can investigate if you're willing to look. Every community has stories that used to be common knowledge and are now known only to a shrinking number of older residents. Every town has archives sitting in basements or storage units, deteriorating slowly, containing information that nobody has looked at in decades. The question is whether we care enough to preserve these things before they're gone completely, whether we're willing to invest the time and resources necessary to maintain our connection to the past, or whether we're content to let history evaporate and accept that future generations will know even less about where they came from than we do. Lori's discovery in the Cannon Beach archive was a gift, a chance to recover something that was nearly lost. But it also highlighted how much has already been lost beyond recovery, and how much more is at risk right now, sitting in conditions that guarantee its eventual destruction. What are you willing to do to prevent that loss in your own community? And what will you tell the next generation when they ask why you didn't act when there was still time? Small communities develop their own realities, and when you isolate them enough, when you reduce the population to a few dozen year-round residents who depend on each other for social interaction and basic services, those realities can diverge from the surrounding world in ways that seem impossible until you've witnessed it yourself. I've always been fascinated by cases where an entire community experiences something together, where the shared experience becomes so reinforced through constant discussion and mutual validation that it achieves a kind of solidity that external skepticism can't penetrate. The Depoe Bay December phenomenon from the early 1990s represents this dynamic in its purest form, and what fills me with disbelief even now isn't necessarily what was reported. It's the absolute consistency of those reports across 3 consecutive years from a community that had every reason to doubt its own perceptions, but instead chose collective certainty. Have you ever been part of a group where everyone experienced something that people outside the group refused to believe, where the division between your reality and everyone else's reality became so stark that communication across that divide felt impossible? That's what happened in Depoe Bay during 3 December periods. And understanding why requires looking at how geographic isolation creates social conditions that amplify and reinforce shared experience until it becomes unshakable truth for those involved, regardless of external verification. Depoe Bay sits on the Central Oregon coast, famous for having what's claimed to be the world's smallest navigable harbor and for its whale-watching opportunities during migration seasons. In the early 1990s, the town's population dynamics were starkly divided between summer and winter. During tourist season, the population could swell to several thousand, with visitors filling hotels, vacation rentals, and campgrounds. But from November through March, the town emptied out dramatically. Year-round residents in 1991 numbered fewer than 800 people, and during the deepest winter months, when weather was most severe and tourist traffic essentially ceased, the functional population, the people actually present in town on any given day, could drop to just a couple hundred. Most businesses closed for the winter or operated on severely reduced schedules. Highway 101, which runs directly through the center of Depoe Bay, saw minimal traffic during winter storms, sometimes going hours without a single vehicle passing through town. This created a peculiar kind of isolation. Depoe Bay wasn't geographically remote in the sense of being hours from other communities. Otter Rock was just a few miles south, and Lincoln City was perhaps 7 miles north. But during winter, particularly during the severe weather that characterizes December storms on the Oregon coast, the town could feel completely cut off from the outside world. The community structure during winter months was tight-knit by necessity. The same few dozen people ran the essential services, the gas station, the small grocery store, the post office. They saw each other daily, knew each other's routines, relied on each other for everything from storm updates to social interaction. This kind of enforced intimacy creates social bonds that are qualitatively different from normal neighborly relationships. When you know that these specific 15 or 20 people are the only humans you're going to interact with for weeks at a time, when you're all weathering the same storms and the same isolation together, you develop a shared perspective that's difficult to explain to outsiders. You start to see the world through a collective lens where individual perception gets validated and reinforced by constant social interaction with people who are experiencing exactly the same conditions you are. The first December phenomenon occurred in 1991, during the second week of the month, when a major storm system had settled over the coast, bringing sustained winds, heavy rain, and conditions that essentially shut down all but emergency travel on Highway 101. According to later accounts compiled from resident interviews, The reports began on December 9th and continued intermittently through December 15th. Kieran, who operated the Depoe Bay gas station and mini-mart during this period, was one of the first to document his observations in writing. In a journal he kept primarily for tracking business operations and weather conditions, he noted on December 9th that he and several customers had observed unusual atmospheric conditions during the late afternoon hours. His description was carefully worded, as if he was trying to capture something difficult to articulate. He wrote about light behavior that didn't match normal storm conditions, about a quality to the air that he described as thick, in a way that wasn't related to fog or precipitation, and about a sound or vibration that seemed to come from multiple directions simultaneously. What's significant is that Kieran's initial observations were corroborated independently by other residents who had no knowledge of his journal entries. Lillian, who worked at the Depoe Bay post office and lived in one of the apartments above the Main Street businesses, made similar reports to friends and neighbors. According to interviews conducted years later, she described the same time period, the same general atmospheric quality, and the same sense that something about the environment was fundamentally different from normal winter storm conditions. The consistency wasn't exact. People described things using different words, emphasized different aspects of what they observed, but the core elements aligned in ways that suggested genuine shared experience rather than socially constructed narrative building on a single person's report. Over the following week, as the storm system persisted and residents remained largely confined to town with minimal outside contact, the observations became more specific and more consistent. People reported the phenomena occurring during specific time windows, primarily late afternoon into early evening, and associated with particular weather conditions, not the most severe moments of the storm, but rather periods of relative calm within the larger storm pattern. The descriptions evolved to include visual elements, unusual light refraction through the heavy cloud cover, shadows that moved in ways that didn't correspond to any visible light source, and what multiple residents described as a distortion of distance perception, where familiar landmarks appeared either closer or farther away than they should be. These weren't hallucinations in any clinical sense. People weren't seeing things that weren't there. They were perceiving actual environmental elements, buildings, rocks, ocean, in ways that seemed distorted or wrong. The sociological effect of geographic isolation becomes crucial to understanding how these perceptions were processed and reinforced. In a larger, more diverse community, you might have skeptics who questioned what was being reported, who offered alternative explanations, who created social permission to doubt. But in Depoe Bay during that December, everyone who was present, the small core of year-round residents who were weathering the storm together, was reporting similar experiences. When you're isolated with a small group, and everyone in that group is perceiving the same anomalies, the social pressure to accept those perceptions as real becomes overwhelming. Doubt becomes socially costly because it separates you from the collective experience. It marks you as someone who isn't part of the shared reality that binds the community together. So even people who might have been privately skeptical found themselves accepting and reinforcing the group narrative, because that's what social cohesion required. The reports from December 1991 eventually faded as the storm system moved on. Highway 101 reopened to normal traffic, and the town began its gradual return to pre-Christmas activity levels. In the weeks following, there was apparently discussion among residents about what they had experienced, attempts to find rational explanations, consideration of whether to report the phenomena to any official agency. According to later accounts, the consensus was to treat it as an interesting but isolated weather-related occurrence, something unusual that had happened during an unusually severe storm, not worthy of external attention or investigation. Most residents apparently assumed it was a one-time event and expected it wouldn't recur. but it did recur almost exactly 1 year later. In December 1992, during another significant storm system that created similar isolation conditions, residents reported the same phenomena. The timing was remarkably consistent, second week of December, late afternoon into evening hours, during periods of relative calm within the larger storm pattern. The descriptions matched the previous year's reports with striking accuracy: the unusual light behavior, the atmospheric thickness, the distance distortion. What makes this recurrence sociologically significant is that not everyone who reported experiences in 1992 had been present in Depoe Bay during December 1991. There were residents who had been traveling or temporarily away during the first occurrence who now reported observing the same phenomena, and their descriptions aligned with the previous year's accounts, despite having no direct knowledge of those earlier reports. This suggests either that the phenomena was genuine and consistent across years, or that the social narrative about what happened in 1991 had become so embedded in community consciousness that it shaped how people interpreted their perceptions in 1992, creating a self-fulfilling cycle of expectation and observation. The winter of 1992-1993 saw increased discussion among Depoe Bay residents about the December pattern. Some people were convinced they were observing a genuine recurring phenomenon, possibly related to specific weather conditions that occurred during early December storms. Others remained skeptical, but were reluctant to voice that skepticism publicly because of the social dynamics involved. Sutton, a local handyman who worked throughout the area and talked to residents across different social circles, later described the community atmosphere during this period as one of collective anticipation mixed with anxiety. People were waiting to see if December 1993 would bring the same experiences, and there was an unspoken understanding that the recurrence, or lack thereof, would determine how the community interpreted what had happened in the previous 2 years. December 1993 brought a third occurrence, again during the second week of the month, again during a major storm system, again with reports that matched the patterns from 1991 and 1992. By this point, the phenomenon had taken on a kind of inevitability in community consciousness. It wasn't surprising when it happened. It would have been surprising if it hadn't happened. The descriptions from 1993 show even greater consistency than previous years, as if the community had developed a shared vocabulary for describing what they were experiencing, agreed upon terms and reference points that allowed for precise communication about the phenomena. This linguistic convergence is significant because it demonstrates how shared experience becomes codified through language, how groups develop specialized ways of talking about things that are unique to their collective experience. What's particularly striking about the Depoe Bay phenomenon is the complete absence of reports from neighboring communities. Otter Rock, just a few miles south, reported nothing unusual during any of the 3 December periods. Lincoln City, slightly farther north, had no reports of similar phenomena. The geographic specificity was absolute. Whatever was being experienced or perceived was confined to Depoe Bay proper, to the specific stretch of coastline and the immediate area around the town. This raises profound questions about what was actually occurring. If the phenomena was environmental, related to weather patterns or atmospheric conditions or oceanic effects, why would it be so precisely localized? If it was perceptual or psychological, what about Depoe Bay specifically created conditions for this shared altered perception that neighboring communities didn't experience? My speculation centers on the unique combination of geographic and social factors that characterize Depoe Bay during winter months in the early 1990s. The town's extreme population fluctuation created winter conditions of isolation that were more severe than neighboring communities. Otter Rock and Lincoln City, while also experiencing reduced winter populations, maintained larger year-round resident bases and had different social structures. Depoe Bay's small size and tight winter community created conditions where shared experience could be reinforced and amplified in ways that wouldn't occur in slightly larger or more diverse populations. Additionally, Depoe Bay's specific geography, the narrow harbor, the way buildings are positioned relative to the ocean and Highway 101, the particular rock formations and cliff structures, might have created localized environmental conditions that didn't extend to surrounding areas. It's possible that unusual light refraction, acoustic effects from wind and water interaction, or other environmental phenomena occurred specifically in Depoe Bay's immediate area due to these geographic factors. The consideration of localized environmental factors versus collective experience is crucial because it determines how we interpret the consistency of reports. If there were genuine environmental phenomena occurring, the consistency makes perfect sense. People were observing and describing real effects, even if they couldn't explain the mechanisms creating those effects. If the consistency was primarily due to social reinforcement and shared narrative building, it's still genuine in the sense that people were experiencing something, but what they were experiencing was partly constructed through the community's collective interpretation and expectation. These aren't mutually exclusive possibilities. You could have real environmental anomalies that were then interpreted and described through socially constructed frameworks, creating reports that reflected both objective phenomena and subjective community narrative. The phenomenon apparently ceased after December 1993. December 1994 brought storms, but no reports of unusual atmospheric conditions. December 1995 was similarly unremarkable. By 1996, the pattern seemed definitively broken, and the community gradually stopped anticipating recurrence. This cessation raises its own questions. If the phenomena was environmental, related to specific meteorological conditions, did those conditions simply not recur after 1993? If it was primarily perceptual and social, what changed in the community dynamics that ended the shared experience? There's no clear answer, and the people involved had no explanation for why it started or why it stopped. It simply did both, appearing for 3 consecutive years and then vanishing as if it had never occurred. The community's reluctance to discuss the phenomena after the tourist season raised concerns is perhaps the most revealing aspect of the entire situation. By the mid-1990s, Depoe Bay was becoming increasingly dependent on tourism revenue, with whale watching and coastal scenery driving the local economy. There was growing awareness among business owners and civic leaders that the town's reputation affected its economic viability. Stories about unexplained phenomena, about residents experiencing strange atmospheric conditions, could be interpreted as charming local color by some visitors, but might also make others uncomfortable or create perceptions that the town was somehow unusual or unwelcoming. The economic calculation was similar to what we saw in other coastal communities. Better to let strange stories fade than to risk them affecting tourism revenue. So by the late 1990s, even among residents who had directly experienced the December phenomena, there was reluctance to bring it up in mixed company or to discuss it with outsiders. The experience remained part of private community memory, but was actively excluded from public narrative about the town. No scientific investigation was conducted despite the 3-year pattern. No meteorologists examined whether there were unusual atmospheric conditions during those specific December periods. No environmental scientists studied whether Depoe Bay's geography created unique conditions that might explain the reports. This lack of investigation wasn't due to conspiracy or cover-up. It was simply that nobody with scientific resources or authority ever knew enough about what was being reported to consider it worth studying. The reports remained internal to the Depoe Bay community, shared among residents but never formalized into documentation that would have attracted external attention. And once the phenomena stopped occurring, the incentive to investigate further essentially disappeared. It became just another local mystery, interesting to the people who experienced it, but not significant enough to warrant ongoing attention or resources. What troubles me about cases like this is the epistemological question they raise about how we determine what's real and what's not. The Depoe Bay residents had consistent reports across 3 years from multiple independent observers describing specific patterns that matched across iterations. By most standards of evidence, that suggests something genuine was occurring, but without external verification, without scientific documentation, without any observers from outside the community confirming the phenomena, we're left with only the community's word that it happened at all, and that community had powerful social incentives to maintain consistency in their reports, to validate each other's experiences, to reinforce the shared narrative that bound them together during isolated winter months. How do we weigh that evidence? How do we separate genuine observation from socially constructed perception when the observers themselves can't make that separation? Have you lived somewhere where the whole community experienced something that outsiders didn't believe? That disconnect between insider knowledge and external skepticism creates a particular kind of frustration and defensiveness. You know what you experienced. You have the corroboration of everyone around you who experienced it too. But people from outside your community treat your accounts as unreliable or delusional. It's a form of epistemic violence, having your reality invalidated because it doesn't match what others consider possible or credible. The Depoe Bay residents, at least those who discussed the phenomena years later, expressed exactly this frustration. They knew what they had experienced. They had each other's confirmation, and the fact that neighboring communities reported nothing and scientists never investigated didn't change their certainty about what had occurred during those 3 December periods. Whether that certainty was justified, whether their shared experience reflected objective phenomena or collective perception shaped by isolation and social reinforcement, remains unanswerable. What's certain is that for a small community on the Oregon coast, 3 Decembers in the early 1990s created a shared reality that set them apart from the surrounding world, and that separation, that division between what they knew and what others would believe, became part of their identity in ways that persist even now, decades later, among the residents who were there and remember. Environmental change carries a particular kind of dread that's different from other fears we experience. When the natural world, which we depend on to be consistent and predictable, starts behaving in ways that contradict our understanding, it creates a fundamental unease that's difficult to articulate or resolve. I've spent years studying how communities respond to ecological disruption, and what consistently emerges is that unexplained environmental anomalies generate more sustained anxiety than disasters we can explain and understand. When a storm destroys a coastline, it's terrible but comprehensible. When an ecosystem shifts for no apparent reason, when the patterns that have held steady for generations suddenly change without warning or explanation, it touches something deeper in us, a recognition that we don't control or even fully understand the systems we're embedded in. The Cape Perpetua ecosystem shift in 1998 represents this phenomenon in its most distilled form. And what keeps me returning to this case is the collective trauma it created in a community that had built its identity around intimate knowledge of their coastal environment, only to watch that environment transform in ways that made no sense, and then, just as inexplicably, return to normal as if nothing had happened. Cape Perpetua is a prominent headland on the central Oregon coast, rising 800 feet above the Pacific Ocean, and featuring some of the most dramatic coastal scenery in the state. The Cape Perpetua Marine Reserve, established in the early 1990s, encompasses approximately 20 square miles of ocean and intertidal habitat, protecting a diverse ecosystem that includes rocky reefs, kelp forests, and extensive tide pool areas. The reserve's establishment came with baseline ecological studies conducted by marine biologists from Oregon State University and other institutions, creating detailed documentation of species populations, habitat characteristics, and ecological relationships as they existed in the early to mid-1990s. These baseline studies were unusually comprehensive for the time, driven by scientific interest in using marine reserves as living laboratories for understanding coastal ecosystem dynamics, and by practical need to establish clear data against which future changes could be measured. The tide pool ecosystems along Cape Perpetua were particularly well documented, with regular monitoring of intertidal species populations, distribution patterns, and seasonal variations. The local community's relationship with these ecosystems was intimate and long-standing. Yachats and the smaller residential areas near Cape Perpetua were home to people who had lived along this coast for generations, whose understanding of tide pool life wasn't academic but experiential, built on decades of observation during recreational tide pooling, fishing, and simply spending time along the shore. These weren't casual visitors or weekend tourists. They were people who knew which pools held which species, who noticed seasonal variations in abundance and behavior, who had mental catalogs of what normal looked like based on years of accumulated observation. This kind of environmental literacy, the deep familiarity that comes from sustained engagement with a specific place, made the community particularly sensitive to changes that others might not notice or might dismiss as normal variation. The shift began in summer 1998, noticed first not by scientists conducting formal surveys, but by local residents who spent time in the tide pools and recognized immediately that something was different. Kaylee, a retired biology teacher who lived in Yachats and walked the Cape Perpetua tide pools almost daily, was among the first to document her observations in writing. In a letter to the Cape Perpetua Visitor Center, dated early July 1998, she described what she characterized as dramatic population changes in common intertidal species, sea stars, which were normally abundant and distributed across multiple tide pool zones, appeared to be either absent or present in unusually low numbers in pools where she had consistently observed them for years. Conversely, certain species of sea anemones seemed to be present in much higher densities than normal, occupying spaces that were typically populated by more diverse assemblages. She noted that these weren't subtle changes requiring careful measurement to detect. They were obvious alterations to the visual landscape of the tide pools, changes that anyone familiar with these specific locations would immediately notice. What made Kaylee's observations particularly credible was her scientific background and her careful documentation habits. She maintained detailed journals of her tide pool observations, not as part of any formal study, but simply because she found it personally satisfying to track what she saw over time. Her journals from previous years provided comparative data showing normal variation in species abundance and distribution, establishing that what she was observing in summer 1998 was well outside the range of typical seasonal fluctuations. She also photographed the tide pools during this period, creating visual records that could be compared to photographs from previous years, and that documented the changes she was describing. Multiple independent observers reported similar changes during the same time period. Fabian, a commercial fisherman who also worked part-time giving tide pool interpretation tours for visitors, noticed the same population anomalies that Kaylee had documented. His observations were based on different pools and different specific locations within the Cape Perpetua area, yet his descriptions matched hers with remarkable consistency. The sea star decline, the anemone increase, and what both described as a general shift in the feel of the tide pools. something about the overall balance of species and the way the ecosystem was functioning that seemed fundamentally altered, even beyond the specific population, changes they could quantify. Marine biologists from the monitoring programs attached to the Marine Reserve began receiving reports from local observers and initiated their own surveys to verify what was being described. Their findings, documented in field notes and preliminary reports from summer and fall 1998, confirmed the observations. Intertidal species populations showed significant deviations from baseline data, with some species exhibiting population declines of 50% or more in surveyed areas, while others showed dramatic increases. The behavioral changes in local wildlife added another layer of strangeness to the situation. Residents reported that seabirds, particularly gulls and cormorants that typically foraged in tide pool areas, seemed to be avoiding certain sections of coastline that they had previously frequented regularly. Harbor seals, which hauled out on specific rocks near Cape Perpetua with predictable regularity, altered their patterns, using different haul-out sites or appearing less frequently than historical observations suggested was normal. These behavioral shifts weren't documented with the same scientific rigor as the intertidal population changes, but they were noticed by enough independent observers that they became part of the collective understanding of what was happening during this period. The ecosystem wasn't just changing in terms of species abundance, it seemed to be functioning differently at multiple levels, from the microscopic organisms in tide pools to the large vertebrates that depended on coastal resources. Understanding environmental trauma requires recognizing that human communities develop psychological relationships with their surrounding ecosystems that go far beyond simple resource extraction or recreational use. For the people living near Cape Perpetua, the tide pools and coastal environment were part of their identity, part of what made this place home rather than just a location. They had knowledge passed down through families about where to find specific species, about seasonal patterns, about the rhythm and character of this particular stretch of coast. When that environment started behaving in ways that contradicted their accumulated knowledge and experience, it created a form of cognitive dissonance that was genuinely distressing. It wasn't just scientific curiosity about why the changes were occurring. It was a deeper anxiety about the stability and predictability of the world they thought they understood. If the ecosystem could shift this dramatically for no apparent reason, what else might change? What other assumptions about the permanence and reliability of their environment might prove unfounded? How unexplained ecosystem shifts create collective anxiety is a process that operates at both individual and community levels. Individually, witnessing environmental change that you can't explain challenges your sense of competence and understanding. People who had spent decades developing expertise about their local tide pools found that expertise suddenly inadequate, unable to explain or predict what they were seeing. This creates personal uncertainty and a sense of lost mastery over familiar territory. At the community level, the shared experience of witnessing the same unexplained changes creates collective anxiety that gets reinforced through social interaction. When everyone you talk to is reporting the same observations, when community gatherings become dominated by discussions of what's happening to the tide pools and speculation about causes, the anxiety amplifies and becomes a defining characteristic of community psychology during that period. This collective anxiety isn't irrational or hysterical. It's a reasonable response to observing significant environmental disruption without adequate explanation, but it creates social dynamics that can be difficult to manage and that leave lasting impressions even after the immediate situation resolves. The relationship between environmental change and community folklore development is something I've observed in multiple contexts, and Cape Perpetua in 1998 followed familiar patterns. In the absence of scientific explanations, communities generate their own narratives to make sense of what they're experiencing. Some Cape Perpetua residents attributed the ecosystem changes to pollution or contamination, though there was no evidence of unusual discharge or environmental damage. Others speculated about climate change effects, which was reasonable given growing awareness of ocean warming and acidification, though the specific changes observed didn't clearly match predicted climate impacts. A few people ventured more exotic explanations involving underwater geological activity or changes in ocean currents that might be affecting local conditions in ways not yet understood by science. These weren't necessarily beliefs in the sense of firm convictions. They were more like provisional frameworks, ways of thinking about the situation that provided some sense of coherence, even if they couldn't be verified. The process of generating and discussing these explanations served important psychological functions for the community. It gave people ways to talk about their anxiety, to feel like they were actively trying to understand rather than passively accepting mystery, and to maintain social bonds through shared speculation and collective sense-making. Marine biologists working in the area during this period were as puzzled as the local community, though their puzzlement was expressed in different language and channeled into different responses. The observed changes didn't match known patterns of disease outbreak, predator-prey imbalance, or environmental disturbance. Water quality testing showed no unusual chemical signatures or pollution markers. Ocean temperature and pH measurements were within normal ranges for the season. And location. The ecosystem appeared to be changing without any detectable external forcing mechanism, which violated basic ecological principles that assume changes in biological systems result from identifiable environmental drivers. Several researchers proposed initiating more intensive monitoring to try to understand what was happening, but institutional barriers, limited funding, and the challenge of mobilizing resources quickly for an unexpected phenomenon meant that the response remained relatively limited. Field observations continued. Data was collected, but the kind of comprehensive investigation that might have identified subtle factors driving the changes never materialized during the crucial window when the phenomenon was most active. My perspective on why natural anomalies feel more disturbing than explained disasters centers on issues of control and comprehension. When a disaster has a clear cause, an earthquake, a tsunami, a storm, we can understand it through our existing frameworks for how the natural world works. We know earthquakes result from tectonic forces. We know storms form from atmospheric conditions. And even though these events are destructive and terrifying, they make sense within our understanding of natural processes. We can take steps to prepare for them, to mitigate their impacts, to rebuild afterward with knowledge that helps us become more resilient. But when nature behaves in ways that don't fit our models, when ecosystems shift for no apparent reason, it undermines the fundamental assumption that the natural world operates according to comprehensible principles. It suggests that there are forces or processes we don't understand, that our scientific knowledge is more limited than we like to believe, and that the environment we depend on might be less stable and predictable than we need it to be. This is profoundly unsettling in ways that transcend simple fear of physical harm. Thoughts on the human need to narrativize environmental uncertainty connect to fundamental aspects of how we process ambiguity and maintain psychological stability. Humans are pattern-seeking creatures who construct narratives to organize experience and create meaning. When we encounter phenomena that resist narrative integration, that don't fit into coherent stories about cause and effect, it creates cognitive stress that we're motivated to resolve. The Cape Perpetua community's various explanatory attempts, from pollution theories to climate speculation to more exotic ideas, represented efforts to narrativize the ecosystem changes in ways that would reduce the anxiety of pure mystery. Even an explanation that implied ongoing danger or difficulty would be preferable to no explanation at all, because at least it would provide a framework for understanding and potentially responding to the situation. The human mind seems to prefer known threats to unknown anomalies, prefer explanations that might be wrong to the absence of any explanation, and this preference drives the creation of community folklore and explanatory narratives even when evidence is insufficient to support them. The ecosystem shift persisted through fall 1998 and into early 1999, with monitoring data continuing to show significant deviations from baseline conditions. Then, gradually, over the course of 1999 and into 2000, the populations began returning to normal patterns. Sea stars reappeared in their typical abundances and distributions. Anemone densities decreased toward historical levels. The overall character of the tide pools, that difficult-to-quantify sense of ecological balance and function that experienced observers could perceive, shifted back toward what had been documented in the pre-1998 baseline studies. By late 2000, according to both formal monitoring data and local observer accounts, the Cape Perpetua intertidal ecosystems had returned to conditions that were statistically indistinguishable from what had been observed in 1996 and 1997. It was as if the 18 to 24-month period of anomalous conditions had been inserted into the normal timeline and then removed, leaving the ecosystem essentially unchanged from where it had been before the shift occurred. This return to baseline conditions brought relief, but not resolution. The anxiety about environmental stability had been temporarily justified by actual observed changes, and then those changes reversed without providing any more explanation than their initial appearance had offered. Scientific publication requires not just observation, but explanation, verifiable mechanisms that can be tested and replicated. The Cape Perpetua phenomenon offered neither. Researchers could document that changes had occurred and that they had subsequently reversed, but they couldn't explain why either the shift or the recovery had happened. Papers describing unexplained temporary ecosystem anomalies are difficult to publish because they offer no theoretical advancement, no mechanism that could be applied to understanding other systems, no predictive power. So despite the documented observations and the extensive monitoring data, no formal research papers were published about the Cape Perpetua ecosystem shift. The data exists in field notes, in agency reports, in the unpublished archives of research institutions, but it was never integrated into the formal scientific literature. The local community's lasting wariness of the Cape Perpetua area reflects the psychological residue of collective environmental trauma. Even years after the ecosystem returned to normal, residents who had witnessed the shift remained somewhat anxious about the tide pools, more alert to potential changes, less certain about the stability of what they were observing. Kaylee continued her daily walks and her observation journals, but she described feeling less confident in her ability to distinguish normal variation from the beginning of another anomalous period. If it could happen once for no reason, it could happen again, and that possibility, however unlikely, changed the psychological relationship people had with an environment they had previously taken for granted as stable and knowable. This lasting impact, this permanent slight elevation of environmental anxiety, is part of what makes collective trauma collective. It's not just that individuals remember the disturbing experience. It's that the community as a whole has had its assumptions challenged in ways that don't fully resolve even after the immediate threat has passed. The absence of published research, despite documented observations, reflects broader challenges in how science handles anomalous events. The scientific process is designed to investigate phenomena that can be reproduced, manipulated, and tested under controlled conditions. Temporary environmental anomalies that appear, persist for a period, and then disappear without clear causal mechanisms don't fit well into this framework. They're one-off events that resist the kind of systematic investigation that generates publishable results. This doesn't mean they're not real or not important, but it does mean they tend to fall through the cracks of formal scientific attention, becoming footnotes and anecdotes rather than subjects of sustained research programs. The Cape Perpetua shift might have represented an opportunity to learn something important about ecosystem dynamics, about resilience and recovery, about environmental forces we don't yet understand, but that opportunity was largely missed because the institutional structures of scientific research aren't well suited to capturing and investigating this kind of transient phenomenon. Marcelo, a park ranger who worked at Cape Perpetua during the 1998-2000 period and remained in the position for years afterward, later reflected on how the incident changed how he thought about environmental management and conservation. In informal conversations with researchers interested in the case, he described feeling that the ecosystem shift had revealed fundamental limitations in human ability to understand and predict natural systems. The marine reserve was supposed to be a protected area where human impacts were minimized and natural processes could function without significant interference. Yet something had happened that was completely outside the manager's ability to anticipate, explain, or control. This realization, he said, made him both more humble about what conservation could achieve and more committed to the importance of long-term monitoring documentation. If we can't always understand or prevent changes, we can at least observe and record them, creating archives that might eventually contribute to better understanding, even if immediate explanation proves elusive. The question of what actually caused the Cape Perpetua ecosystem shift remains unanswered. Speculation ranges from subtle ocean current changes that affected nutrient delivery and larval transport to undetected disease events that preferentially impacted certain species, to unusual patterns in predator abundance that cascaded through the food web, to environmental factors we don't yet know how to measure or detect. Any of these explanations might be partially correct, or the cause might have been some combination of factors that created conditions unique to that specific time and place. The scientific reality is that we simply don't know, and unless similar events occur in well-monitored locations where rapid, comprehensive investigation is possible, we may never know. This uncertainty is uncomfortable for scientists trained to seek definitive answers and for communities that want to understand their environment. But it's also an honest acknowledgement of the limits of current knowledge and methodology. Have you witnessed nature behaving in ways that made you question what you understand about the world? Not dramatic disasters or extreme weather, but subtle wrongness, ecosystems, or animal behaviors that didn't match your experience and expectations, changes that made you wonder if the natural world operates according to principles you don't fully grasp. This isn't an uncommon experience, particularly for people who spend significant time in natural environments and develop the observational skills to notice when things are off. But we rarely talk about these experiences in ways that take them seriously, that treat them as potential insights into environmental dynamics, rather than dismissing them as anecdotal or subjective. The Cape Perpetua community's experience suggests that maybe we should pay more attention to these observations, that environmental anomalies noticed by experienced local observers might be telling us something important about ecosystem variability and change that formal scientific monitoring misses or dismisses as noise in the data. The Cape Perpetua ecosystem shift represents an intersection of environmental science, community psychology, and the limits of human understanding that I find endlessly thought-provoking. An ecosystem changed dramatically for reasons no one could determine, persisted in its altered state for nearly 2 years, then returned to baseline conditions just as mysteriously. A community that depended on that ecosystem for both material resources and psychological stability experienced collective anxiety and lasting impacts on how they related to their environment. Science documented what happened, but couldn't explain it, couldn't generate the kind of mechanistic understanding that would allow prediction or control of similar future events. And in the end, the incident faded from formal attention, preserved primarily in the memories of people who were there and in the unpublished data archives that few people will ever examine. What does it mean that we live in a world where nature can do things we can't explain, where our best scientific tools and most careful observations still leave us with mysteries that resist resolution? Maybe it means we need to develop more humility about what we know and more respect for the complexity of systems we're embedded in. Maybe it means we should invest more resources in long-term monitoring and in rapid response capabilities that could investigate anomalies when they occur. Or maybe it just means accepting that the natural world will always exceed our ability to fully comprehend it, that mystery and uncertainty are inherent features of our relationship with the environment, and that learning to live with that uncertainty without excessive anxiety is one of the challenges of being human in a world we didn't create and can't completely control. 7 incidents, 7 decades of silence. From Neptune State Park to Cape Perpetua, these documented events share a common thread. Communities chose to forget. Whether driven by economic concerns, social pressure, or simple neglect, the result remains the same. History erased, questions unanswered, witnesses silenced. What other coastal mysteries have vanished from collective memory? What stories from your town have been deliberately forgotten or accidentally lost? Share your own forgotten local incidents in the comments below. If you found these cases compelling, subscribe to Unspoken Fears for more investigations into the stories that communities stopped talking about. Remember, silence doesn't erase truth, it just buries it deeper. Until next time, keep questioning what you've been told to forget.